This is The War on Alcohol, Prohibition, and the Rise of the American State, written by Lisa McGurra. I think that's how you say that. Nonfiction, history, focusing on a really specific social historical aspect. This was written in 2016, and it's 255 pages long. This book is meant to be a piece about a specific aspect of prohibition. It gives you the history on prohibition, of course, to lay the groundwork for what was seen as the later development of a stronger federal and state-powered government, and for the really strong loyalty-based political aspect of daily American lives. And I found it quite interesting, so I wanted to share it with you guys. The takeaway that I mostly got from this was essentially the rise of things like the temperance movement, especially keeping in mind that they were mostly coming from I would say almost like certain revivalist movements. There have been Christian revivalist movements, evangelical movements, things like that, that have taken an issue, usually just one or two in particular, and just hammering those home with campaigning, pressure campaigns on politicians, and the creation of a new set of rules. And that prohibition is one of the keystone examples of those. But also showing how, despite these groups essentially getting what they wanted, it turns out they didn't get what they wanted in two different ways. The results usually weren't what they were seeking, and the actual results were usually something that made problems worse, not better. It's hard to actually speak on this one too much without just saying to read it, in part because of the critique behind this book, which is pretty unanimous. But I'm going to save that for the end like I usually do. What's top of mind when I think about what did I get out of this book? Usually when you are engaging in some way with the Prohibition era, and in case anybody doesn't know what we're referring to, this would be the era where it was essentially illegal to create and distribute alcohol, yet ironically not to consume it, which is always interesting for the general public at large. This leads to things like, you may have heard the phrase, I think they're called blue laws, where I think some of these still exist. A place that sells alcohol cannot operate, or cannot at least sell that alcohol during a certain time period on a Sunday, for example. And the question a lot of people have today is why? Like it is 2024. How is this still a thing? Do we also still need reminders about the proper way to hitch our horses to a post? So they get a law passed, or really more than one, to ban this sort of thing. But it turns out we are, as a race of beings on this planet, we are really into our alcohol, and so simply just making it illegal isn't really going to stop us. It's just going to make us go about it a different way. The way we normally see this shown in movies, television, and other books is the classic speakeasy, which is the idea that there's some sort of business front that's hiding another business behind it, and that other business that's in hiding is one that's a bit more pubby, bar-y, clubby. People are showing up and there's booze to be had and things of that nature. And you'll often see in those references that law enforcement is often very aware that those operations are ongoing, and yet they have to be pressured to do anything about it. Why? Well, because that law enforcement also is made of human beings who would like that booze, or they're simply just being paid off and money is nice too. It's the only thing we're more addicted to than alcohol, right? And that's all true, but I guess I didn't realize about this other aspect of it, which was the way that same law enforcement was actually enforcing the law. You were fine if you could bribe them in some way, of course, and you could continue to operate an establishment that could serve many, 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 many people. If, however, you were creating your own stuff and only having it yourself or you and the family that lived with you, that's what got targeted. And it was actually a huge motivator for the current incarceration, prison-focused system that we see all across the United States today. And no surprise, the people who were constantly being busted weren't the well-known, easy-to-find establishments, but instead the much harder-to-find people that just happened to be those with accents, different skin colors, things like that. They seem to find them just fine, which is just an aspect I never really thought of. I think the closest that I came to knowing that was a thing is the stock car situation, right? The idea that somebody's making moonshine somewhere or whatever it is that they're brewing up, and they are taking some crazy path to deliver it somewhere else, and cops are on them. It's very exciting. It's very actiony. When in reality, the most common and frequent type of bust being done wasn't these wild car chases through the woods and back roads. Instead, it was this family that is just barely able to get by, having their homes ripped apart. And it definitely, nobody's really a fan of prohibition. So it's amazing that you could actually come away from this book liking it even less, which is where I found myself. I did mention there was a criticism with this title that I wanted to share because you know what? They're right. No surprise that this is a pretty unanimous thing. It's showing up in reviews that are very positive on this book and elsewhere. The author is a professor, and nobody questions her knowledge on this subject. What they felt like, though, was that this book felt more as if it were a lecture than it was a book. So it wasn't simply that it was just dry, it was that the way the information was presented felt much more like you were being prepared to take a test. And that's great in that environment. It's not so great to actually read it. You know what I mean? So I will say this, it wasn't so much that it took me a long time to get through, but I do recall as I was reading it, I would skim over paragraphs sometimes because they would get heavy in the weeds on certain statistics, and I never really enjoy, and I'm sure I've mentioned this before on a Shelf Life episode, the statistical paragraphs in the books that I read don't interest me. It's just something that it doesn't really help my understanding of the topic that I'm trying to read about. So I do know I had to do that quite a bit when I was reading this book. And yet I'm sharing it with you guys because obviously I liked it. Just know that the take this book is trying to speak on is a little different than what you might find in most places. It's, again, not just simply prohibition and exciting organized crime stuff. In fact, it mostly mentions, yes, this stuff was real, this gave rise to a lot of organized crime, but it's looking more at what were the social aspects to create it, what were the social aspects while it was happening, and how did that change the way our government worked because of how prohibition worked. So it's a lot more specific than it may appear to be just based on the title. And with that, I will bid you guys a farewell.